Hello and welcome to the very first Spirit of Nature art journal tutorial. I hope there are going to be many more of these to come, where I take you through my process to give you inspiration and tips and ideas of how to be able to create your own art journal pages. Now we will explore in other videos more about art journaling and why we do that, but today let's just get stuck in and look at how I created this page so that you can start to get some inspiration for your own. Now, when I sat down to do this page, I had no idea what I was doing. I literally had an idea that I wanted to blend a dark purple and a pale purple together for my background. I didn't even know what direction that blend was going to go in, whether it's horizontal, whether it's vertical. As you can see from here, it turned out to kind of be this central blend that I went for, but that was just me putting paint on the page. I'm using a liquid acrylic paint here and just a dry brush just to start to get those two colours down on the page, and just a very, very rough blend to start with here. Now this paler purple was a bit thick, so I just added a little squirt of water there just to help me move it around the page enough so I could start to get that blend happening. And now just going back in with the darker colour just to start to pull those two colours together and get that blended look that I'd had in my mind when I first sat down to do this page. Now I'm just going in with a baby wipe, so that moisture of the baby wipe just helping me to move that colour around the page even more and to get that softer blend. Again, adding a little bit of water where I felt I needed to be able to move the paint around a little bit. And you can start to see here, just completely by accident, with me moving that paint around the page with the baby wipe, so I started to get this blend that was almost like the sunlight coming down through the clouds. Again, it was just completely what happened. I didn't plan that, but I started to like the look of it, so I followed on with doing that on the other page as well, because that just seemed to kind of pop off the page to me. So now we've got that nice basic background, I wanted to start to get a bit of texture feeling on the page. So I'm going in with that very same pale purple paint that I was using for that blend, adding a little bit of water to it just to make it a little bit more fluid, and using a stencil and just a normal cosmetic sponge just to add some of that kind of texture to that background, helping it pop. Now the key when you are adding paint through a stencil is you'll see here, I'm putting that paint on the cosmetic wipe and then dabbing it off before I go in with the stencil. So we want as little paint on that cosmetic sponge when we go in as possible and build it up through layers. Although I've quite liked the kind of slightly dreamy misty look that having a very light layer it gives me here on this particular page. And again, I'm following that kind of sunlight angle that came through that blend with the baby wipe and choosing to put the stencil on a bit of an angle to follow that as well. And balancing that out now on the other side. And again, just going in here just to add that balance, a little bit more on that side there, so we've got that more balanced feeling. Again, wanting to add more texture here, so I'm going to do some stamping. This is quite a complex background stamp, lots of detail on there. So I'm using an ink, a pigment ink there that's going to pick up all of those details. I've put a foam sheet underneath to help me with that stamping. I'm using a dark purple ink just to complement that background and giving a good squish down to make sure there's as much contact as possible. There we go. See what I mean? It's a very detailed stamp. Perfect for adding that extra kind of texture to the background. And I'm going to again balance that out on the other side. Not a direct copy, so I'm just going to use part of it down in that bottom corner there. Now, I wanted just to put that into the background a little bit more so it didn't stick out from that purple blended background quite so much. So the first thing I did just before it dried completely was just to give it a little wipe with the baby wipe. Again, just taking some of that darker pigment off. And now I'm just going back in, same technique as I used with the stenciling, same pale purple acrylic paint mixed with a bit of white gesso. And I'm just using that makeup sponge just to dab a very, very light cover over the top of it. And as that dries, you'll still see all of the detail and the pattern, but it will just knock it into the background a little bit. And this dries very quickly, so you'll literally see that starting to happen as I go over and do the other side over here. And it's through all these layers that we really start to build up a really interesting page. A lot of what we put down on our pages gets covered over with other things, but it's still important that we put them down. And I'm just using that leftover paint here, just putting my paintbrush in there and adding some splatters. Can't go wrong with some splatters on a journal page. Now, I'd knocked all those butterflies into the background on that stamping. I kind of wanted to pull them out from the background a little bit. So I'm just using some leftover scraps of card that I had made from previous projects. And I'm going back in with that same ink, but just picking out the butterflies on that stamp, stamping them on, and then I'm going to cut those out. Now, these backgrounds have just been made using distress inks. I'm sure we'll do a video tutorial at some point of some fun ways we can use distress inks to make these really interesting, colourful, and very kind of textural backgrounds, really. They're using distress inks in this way, nothing feels particularly flat and boring. So just fussy cutting around this butterfly, getting as much detail as I can. And then we can see just putting that directly over the same image on the background. I'm just using some of the purpley pink distress ink to go around those edges where I've cut so we can't see the white edges of the card. And again, it just helps to frame them and helps them to pop a little bit as well. And then just going in with my white gel pen just to add some highlights. So I really want these butterflies to pop off the page. Now I wanted to add some more complementary splatters to those pale ones, so I picked a really nice bright vivid magenta which really complements those colours. It's not the exact same colour that I used on the background, but it's one that's in the same colour family. And this, again, this acrylic paint is quite thick, so I've just added a bit of water to it to make it easier to use. Same thing, adding some splatters, and I'm particularly following that line of the kind of sun rays that we got with that blend. Just cleaning up as I go along so I don't accidentally end up splodging something on the page. Now, I decided when I started putting those cut out butterflies down that I didn't want to put them directly over the same images on the background stamp. I wanted to soften that kind of border. So I decided to kind of put them down that line there so that they were sort of half on it and half off, and graduated them down in size. You'll see I made a few more off screen there. I'm just sticking them down now and just mopping up any extra little bits of glue as I go along so we don't end up with glue splodges on the page. And boy, these little ones here were so tiny I had to use tweezers. Now I still wanted to make sure these butterflies popped off the page as much as possible, so I'm giving them some shading. I'm using Inktense watercolour pencils here. On this side I'm using the black, so I'm just outlining that side of the butterfly and using my water pen just to activate it. I have done the same on the other side, you'll notice there, with the same dark magenta, where I've done the same thing, outlined it, that side of the butterfly, with the magenta pencil, and use my water brush just like I'm doing on this side, just to activate that and create that shading behind it, which again helps them to really pop off the page. I like using these watercolour pens because they've got the reservoir built in, and you can just give them a little squeeze and get as much water as you want and need in that particular area. But you can just as easily use a normal paintbrush and a little pot of water. And any water-soluble pencil or even just normal watercolour here will work as well. Now wanting to add a little bit more texture to the background, so just adding, I'm using Distress ink here and I'm matching that ink colour to the background colour, and just using, this is just a little, this little stamp is just X's, but it doesn't really matter what kind of stamp that we use, but this is more just about just adding that detail to the background. And again, using the baby wipe just to soften that a little bit. I don't want it to move around too much, but I just wanted to soften that. And now one of my favourite things to do, using an old credit card and just, again, dabbing it into that same ink pad and just adding some marks onto that background. Again, it's all about adding texture. All of this helps the page to pop and add that feeling of depth to the page. And of course, I've very much chosen, kind of two key colours here just to really match and blend with each other. But you can go super colourful and use as many colours as you like. But you do what you want to do and what you're drawn to. I quite like sometimes having just a limited colour palette because it stops me from needing to think and make too many choices and decisions. I'm just using here some round, small cookie cutter shapes. Just again, same thing as with a credit card, just dipping them into the Distress ink and then just placing them on the page wherever I felt the need to. Love adding circles like this. Seems to add that sense of movement. There's something about circles that add movement to the page. Now I'm coming in with a focal point stamp. This is a really nice kind of a flower splash, quite grungy feel stamp. Again, I'm using the same dark purple ink as I used for that background stamp with the butterflies on, and just placing that off center because I want to draw the eye across to it. And now starting to bring those circles off the page, starting to give them that feeling of being bubbles, being 3D rather than just circles. So I'm using my white gel pen just to add a highlight to one section of the circle, and using my watercolor pen just to bring that out into the circle. Now, I'm being quite careful here because I used a distress ink to stamp those circles, and of course distress inks are water reactive, so I need to be careful not to get that water brush too close to the edge of that circle there, otherwise we'll just lose that stamp image. But just blending that white into the centre of the circle, and already you can start to see how that gives them that 3D feeling of bubbles. And this is such a therapeutic activity. I could literally do this for hours. That pen dries, just going back in where I feel it needs to blend a bit more. And now I want to do the same with a darker, just to contrast that. So again, I'm picking that same Inktense watercolour pencil in that kind of dark magenta colour, and just going in on the opposite side of the circle and doing exactly the same thing. Using my watercolour brush just to ease that colour in to the circle. Little dab with a tissue just to help get that right blend. And it's with the shading that everything really starts to pop off the page. Everything starts to feel like it's 3D, that you could reach out and touch it rather than it just being a flat page. And this is where all those layers start to reveal themselves. We notice the things peeking out from behind, so we can still see the words from the original page behind in that bubble. And I really like that. Now I want to put some sentiments. This is an art journal page after all, so thinking about a sentiment or some words that will mean something to me from doing this process. Again, I've picked a bit of scrap paper from a previous project where I'd used some distress inks to create a kind of watercolour effect background, and stamped on using that same deep purple ink. And now just cutting around that so that I can see where I want to place it. I want to just distress the edge of that. It just felt very sharp lines, so I'm just using my scissors just to distress the edge of that sentiment there. Now just using that same distress ink just to darken the edges, take away that whiteness from where the paper's been cut before I stick that down. And here we go, the final piece. I hope you like it. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. And I hope it's inspired you to create your own art journal page. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.